all just kind of take electricity for granted, don't we? It's that ever-present hum, It's like a switch, and it's there, powers everything, like that really reliable friend who, well, never lets you down. But what if that friend isn't quite as invincible as we think? What if it can fail? Not just from a simple glitch, but from this complex web of threats that seem to be getting more sophisticated all the time. Today, in this deep dive, we're going to pull back the curtain a bit on the unexpected vulnerabilities of our power grids. We'll explore what real preparedness looks like, from the big national systems right down to what you can do in your own home.
Yeah, and in our sources for this, they really range quite widely. We've got government guidance on cybersecurity, some really meticulous expert analyses looking at advanced warfare scenarios. And then on the other end, super practical tips for personal preparedness for businesses too, stuff you can actually use right away.
Right. So our mission today, cut through the noise, pull out those critical insights you need, and really empower you, our listener, to be well-informed and prepared for securing our energy future. Okay, so let's dig into this. When we think about power outages, our minds usually jump straight to natural disasters, right? Blizzards, hurricanes, heat waves. Those are the familiar ones.
Oh, absolutely. They're definitely significant factors. Heat waves, winter storms, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, they can all knock out power, no question.
Yeah.
But there's another threat, maybe less obvious, but potentially very impactful, that comes from space, actually. Geomagnetically induced currents, GICs they're called,
Yeah.
caused by solar flares.
GICs, solar flares.
Yeah, think of them like these invisible, huge electrical surges that get induced right into our power lines because of solar activity. And these surges, well, they can destabilize the grid, they can lead to temporary voltage problems, widespread blackouts even, and they can actually permanently damage those critical, really expensive transformers that take a long time to replace.
Wow, okay. I'd honestly never really thought about solar flares being a direct threat to the grid like that. So what can actually be done about space weather then? Is it just something we have to, brace for? Or can we mitigate it?
Oh, we absolutely can mitigate it, and we are. There are strategies being developed, being implemented. There's a great example, actually, from Transpower New Zealand Ltd. They worked really closely with researchers, and they found this quite balanced approach for their specific grid. They figured out that by disconnecting just 24 specific high-voltage lines in a targeted way,
Just 24.
just 24, they could get a 16% reduction in these GICs. And they're looking at adding capacitor blocking devices too for maybe another 16% reduction. What's really interesting there is how it shows just how vital that collaboration is, between the researchers and the industry, finding practical real-world fixes.
That is fascinating, how specific those solutions can be. But, while nature throws some intense stuff at us, it often feels like the human element introduces the most unsettling vulnerabilities. We've definitely seen real-world incidents of cyber attacks and sabotage affecting power grids, haven't we?
We absolutely have, yeah. The sources we looked at cite several examples, like back in 2013, a criminal drug cartel actually caused a blackout in Mexico's Michoacan state. Then Yemen had a blackout in 2014 from mortars and rockets.
Yeah.
Pakistan in 2015 caused by terrorists. And there were also alleged cyber attacks Turkey in 2015, supposedly from Iran, and Ukraine in both 2015 and 2016, attributed to Russia.
Right. Those Ukrainian attacks got a lot of attention.
They did. But it's important to note, the sources generally suggest these incidents, while significant, were often temporary. Or they happened in, let's say, simpler, less complex grids than what you might find in, say, the U.S. In fact, some cyber experts actually express a bit of skepticism about the idea of cyber attacks causing protracted nationwide blackouts in really diverse and complex grids, like the U.S. grid, which has, 3,000 different electric utilities. That diversity itself is a kind of defense.
That's a really crucial distinction. So if cyber and sabotage might have limitations for taking down a whole complex national grid for a long time,
Yeah.
kind of begs the question, right? What's the ultimate weapon some adversaries might be considering to achieve that kind of widespread lasting effect?
Well, that brings us squarely to the nuclear electromagnetic pulse threat, EMP. This comes up specifically in the military doctrines of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. They talk about it as a, quote, revolutionary new way of warfare. It's seen as potentially relatively easy, maybe even anonymous, a way to inflict mass destruction through causing these long, drawn-out blackouts.
EMP. Okay. How does that actually work?
So basically, any nuclear weapon, even a fairly primitive one, generates an EMP when detonated, especially at high altitude. It has three main parts, E1, E2, and E3. The really critical one to understand is E1. Think of it like a super fast, incredibly powerful electrical jolt. It can instantly damage tiny electronics, control systems, stuff in cars, planes, communications, and definitely the power grid. And it's so fast and strong that your standard lightning protection, it just doesn't stop it.
Doesn't stop it. Wow.
Nope. E2 is also fast, but it's more like natural lightning, so standard protections generally work against E2. And E3 is a slower, longer-lasting pulse. It affects long things like power lines and communication lines, potentially causing them to overheat or fail over time.
Okay, so putting that together, what does it really mean for us on the ground? How big an area are we talking about? What are the consequences?
It's potentially vast. A single nuclear weapon, detonated high above a target, we're talking maybe 30 to 400 kilometers up, can spread an EMP field across an area the size of North America.
North America. From one weapon.
Potentially, yeah. Accuracy isn't really the point because the radius is so huge, hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. So, for example, the sources suggest a relatively small 10-kiloton weapon detonated at a fairly low, high altitude, say 30 kilometers over the U.S. eastern grid, could potentially cause a protracted blackout of that entire grid, not just a flicker, but a long-term outage.
How? Just from the initial pulse?
From cascading failures. The initial pulse damages key components, and then the system destabilizes, leading to knock-on effects. This could impact maybe 75% of the nation's electricity and most of the population. Think about the 2003 Northeast blackout that started from a tree branch.
Right, I remember that.
This would be like that, but potentially much, much bigger and lasting far longer. And here's a key difference from cyber or sabotage. EMP effects aren't just theoretical, they're proven. We have hard data. The U.S. did a high-altitude nuclear test back in 1962 called Starfish Prime, and it caused streetlights to fail in Hawaii 900 miles away. So the idea of widespread electrical damage isn't speculation. It's based on observed reality.
That's sobering. And you mentioned how some military doctrines view EMP. It's not always put in the same box as traditional nuclear war.
Exactly. That's a fascinating and, frankly, worrying point from the sources. Some countries, including China, even though they have an official no-first-use nuclear pledge, seem to regard EMP attack as part of, quote, all-out cyber warfare or radio-electronic warfare.
So not necessarily crossing the nuclear threshold in their view.
Potentially. By framing it that way, it might seem more acceptable to them. The sources even note some analysts in places like Germany and Japan see it similarly because it primarily destroys electronics, not cities or people directly.
Okay. And then there's this concept of super EMP.
Yes. The sources raise concerns about the development of so-called super EMP warheads. These are apparently capable of generating pulses maybe 4 times stronger than what the U.S. has tested our grid hardening against.
4 times stronger.
Yeah. The sources state that Russia has developed these and possibly transferred the technology or know-how to North Korea, which means, potentially, even our best-protected military assets could be vulnerable to this kind of weapon. The U.S. apparently doesn't possess these itself.
That's deeply concerning. So if an EMP attack is that devastating, it makes you wonder, wouldn't traditional nuclear deterrence, mutually assured destruction, prevent it? Or is there a complication?
That's the core challenge.
Yeah.
Deterrence works best when you know exactly who attacked you, so you can retaliate.
Right. Attribution.
Precisely. But an EMP attack could potentially be delivered in ways that make attribution incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible. Think about launching one from a freighter ship in international waters, or maybe from a satellite in a polar orbit. The sources mention North Korea's KMS-3 and KMS-4 satellites, for example, which have orbited over the U.S. in trajectories suitable for this. That anonymity really undermines the traditional deterrence model.
The sources also get into some pretty specific geopolitical scenarios, don't they? Outlining potential motives for these kinds of attacks. What are the common threads there?
Well, you see a pattern where adversaries might seek strategic goals or want to destabilize rivals without necessarily engaging in, like, a direct conventional military fight. The grid becomes a vulnerable point. So the sources detail possibilities like Iran striking Israel or Saudi Arabia driven by regional power struggles and ideology, or Pakistan striking Israel perhaps to assert leadership in the Sunni world, North Korea targeting South Korea and Japan maybe for reunification goals or revenge, but also potentially paralyzing U.S. military staging areas in the region.
Which could cause huge knock-on effects.
Exactly, including things like industrial accidents, even potential nuclear reactor meltdowns if cooling systems fail. Then there's China, potentially striking Taiwan, or maybe a U.S. aircraft carrier group, part of reunification aims or regional power projection. And Russia possibly striking European NATO members, as a way to try and upend the current world order. The sources even talk about this concept of a new axis: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, describing them as being dissatisfied with the current, U.S.-dominated world order and, as the sources put it, fearing freedom, which makes them sort of tacit allies.
Okay, so just to be clear, these are scenarios outlined in the sources we reviewed. We're reporting on their analysis here.
Absolutely. This is their assessment of potential motivations and alliances.
So with all these evolving threats, these asymmetrical approaches, what does this mean for the U.S. specifically? Does this analysis suggest we're less prepared than we used to be?
There's definitely concern expressed in the sources about U.S. readiness, yeah. The argument made is that the U.S. military might be less prepared for and more vulnerable to a surprise EMP attack compared to, say, the height of the Cold War. They point to things like strategic bombers no longer being on constant strip alert and vulnerabilities in critical command, control, communications, and intelligence systems, the C3I systems.
And are there specific times mentioned when we might be particularly vulnerable, like windows of opportunity for an adversary?
Yes, the sources discuss this idea of a long Sunday. This refers to periods when national vigilance might be naturally lower. Think about transitions between presidential administrations, when leadership might be less cohesive for a time, or even major holiday periods like Thanksgiving through New Year's Day. These are potentially seen as windows when an attack might achieve greater surprise.
That's quite a sobering picture of the vulnerabilities. But understanding the threats is just the first step, isn't it? The really big question is, what can we actually do about it? So let's shift focus now to preparedness. What does good preparedness look like, maybe starting at that national level?
Okay, yeah. Many countries are definitely stepping up their game on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. Australia's ECSO guidance for what they call systems of national significance is highlighted as a really good model in our sources. It involves basically two main types of cybersecurity exercises. You have discussion-based ones, like tabletop exercises where teams just talk through how they'd respond to an incident.
Talking it through.
Right. And then you have operational or functional exercises where people actually do their roles in a simulated scenario, like a live drill.
Okay, that makes sense. Testing the plan in action.
Exactly. And the core idea isn't just doing the exercises, but having really rigorous, regular testing, followed by mandatory, transparent evaluations. These evaluation reports are key. They have to clearly state what worked, what didn't, lessons learned, and importantly, the required actions for improvement. It's not just about running the drill. It's about genuinely learning and fixing things with strong oversight to make sure it actually happens.
So what makes an exercise good, in their view, not just going through the motions?
Right. The criteria they lay out include things like, is the exercise clearly aligned with the organization's overall cybersecurity strategy? Does it test scenarios that are both likely and would have a high impact? Does it really assess if people can operationalize the incident response plans, not just know the plan, but actually do it? And critically, do the evaluation reports include solid recommendations with timelines? And this is important. Do they focus on checking if recommendations from previous exercises have actually been fixed?
Ah, so checking for follow-through.
Precisely. If the same recommendations keep popping up exercise after exercise without being resolved, that's flagged as a major cause for concern. Accountability is built in.
That sounds like a really robust approach at the national infrastructure level. Okay, let's bring this closer to home now. What about for you, the listener? If you're running a business or just thinking about your own household preparedness, what are the best practices?
Yeah, for both businesses and individuals, the sources really stress having comprehensive emergency kits. For businesses, even if you have a generator, you need a plan B, right? What if the generator fails or you run out of fuel? So these kits need essentials like battery-powered flashlights or, even better, headlamps so your hands are free. A hand-cranked radio is crucial for getting updates when power and internet are down.
Good point. The radio.
Definitely. Plus a well-stocked first aid kit and just a basic toolbox for simple repairs or needs.
And the sources get pretty specific about home kits too, right? Beyond just the flashlight and radio.
They do. They talk about broader categories like having emergency food and water supplies, enough for several days or even longer depending on your situation. Also, sanitation supplies, think about toilets not flushing if water pressure goes. Items for shelter and warmth like blankets, sleeping bags, and personal protective gear, maybe masks or gloves depending on the scenario. They even give practical food safety tips for after a blackout. Basically, discard perishable food that's been above 40 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 2 hours.
2 hours, okay.
Or if it just looks or smells weird, obviously. When in doubt, throw it out. But food in a full freezer might stay frozen longer. And if it's still colder than 40 degrees and has ice crystals, it can usually be refrozen safely.
Good practical tip.
And of course, remember to restock anything you use from your kit afterwards.
Makes sense. Okay, so beyond the basic kit, how do we handle things like keeping the lights on, staying warm, especially if an outage drags on? What are the options?
Right, alternative power and heating. For lighting, the sources point out how incredibly efficient small LED lights are now. Like a single 5-watt LED bulb, a modest 2 kilowatt-hour battery pack could potentially power that for 80 days if you only used it for, say, 5 hours a day.
Wow, 80 days.
Yeah, they sip power.
Yeah.
Of course, you've also got traditional lamps, oil lanterns, but with a big safety warning. Always have fire extinguishers handy, and seriously consider a carbon monoxide detector. The sources even mention the old canary in a coal mine idea for safety.
Right, ventilation is key with those.
Absolutely. Candles are an option, but again, fire risk. Battery-operated motion sensor lights are handy for navigating in the dark. For charging small electronics like phones or radios, those portable solar generators are quite popular now. Units in the 500 to 1,000 watt-hour range can keep things topped up or run small appliances for a few hours.
And for bigger needs, like running a fridge or something.
For larger scale, you're looking at things like deep cycle AGM batteries. They're designed for that kind of use, combined with solar panels and charge controllers to manage the system. Some sources even mention repurposing golf cart batteries, which are quite robust, connected to an inverter to get AC power.
Okay, interesting. What about heat and cooking? That seems like a big one, especially in winter.
Definitely.
Hmm.
First off, prioritize foods that don't need cooking. That simplifies things a lot. For cooking alternatives, you've got things like campfires, but obviously that's an outdoor solution. For heating, wood-burning stoves are great if you have one, but the key is you need to have stacked and dried the wood well in advance. It takes time.
Can't just cut it down when the power goes out.
Exactly. Propane is another major option. A big 500-gallon tank holds a lot of energy, like 13,400 kilowatt hours worth. If you use it really frugally, maybe just heating one room, minimal electricity, perhaps with heat recovery systems, it could potentially last for years. But flip side, if you hook that same tank up to a big whole house generator running everything, you could drain it in days. So usage makes a huge difference.
That's a really important perspective on fuel consumption.
Yeah. And one other point, natural gas lines, while usually reliable, can actually freeze up in severe, prolonged cold snaps, so that's not always foolproof either. And water, of course. If you're on a well, you absolutely need a generator or backup power for your pump, and having water filters or purifiers is essential regardless of your source.
You know, I saw someone on a forum suggest actually exercising your home preparedness plan. What do they mean by that, and is it a good idea?
Yeah, that's a really practical piece of advice we saw echoed in some sources too. The idea is to occasionally, maybe once a year, just flip your main circuit breaker off for a few hours or even a day. It's a controlled way to test your readiness. What works? What doesn't? What did you forget? It really is, as they say, better to find out there's a problem now than later when it's a real emergency.
But there was a caution about that too, right? With older panels?
Yes, absolutely crucial caution. If you have an older electrical panel, especially certain brands like Federal Pacific or Zinsco, they are known fire hazards and might fail dangerously if you operate the main breaker. So if you have an old panel, definitely get it inspected by a qualified electrician before trying something like this. Maybe even consider replacing it. And another critical safety tip mentioned, whenever you're using any alternate power source, like a generator, make absolutely sure it's connected safely. Never, ever plug it directly into a wall outlet or wire it into your existing circuits without a proper transfer switch. That can backfeed the grid and is incredibly dangerous for utility workers trying to restore power.
Okay, safety first. Definitely.
And one last point on mindset. While people understandably worry about big things, like keeping medical equipment running, which is a serious issue that needs specific planning, some sources offer perspective from things like camping or hiking. The takeaway there is often that, you don't actually need that much electricity to live okay for a little while, provided you have the real basics covered. Food, water, warmth, sanitation. The goal isn't necessarily complete self-reliance for every single modern convenience. It's about building reasonable preparedness and resilience with what you have and what you can realistically manage.
That's a good way to frame it. Resilience not necessarily replicating normal life completely. Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this really mean for you, our informed listener? What are the big takeaways?
Well, I think the key takeaways from this deep dive are pretty clear. First, our power grids are facing threats that are becoming more diverse. and, frankly, more sophisticated. We're talking everything from space weather, which we might not think about often, to these combined arms, cyber, and potentially EMP attacks. And sometimes, according to the sources, these threats might come from what they describe as new Axis states who are challenging the current order.
So a wider range of threats than maybe we typically consider.
Exactly. And because of that, preparedness really has to be multi-layered. It needs robust national strategies like those exercise models we discussed. It needs diligent businesses doing their part. And it requires thoughtful, practical planning by individuals and families. And ultimately, understanding the why behind these different threats and the how of the various solutions and preparedness steps, that's what's really crucial for taking effective action and building genuine resilience.
Understanding leads to better action. Makes sense.
And maybe one final thought to leave you with. Consider this. The sources we looked at spent a lot of time discussing how nations prepare, how critical infrastructure operators prepare, and how you, as an individual, can prepare your own household for a grid failure. But what if the ultimate measure of a society's resilience isn't just its ability to technically survive a blackout? What if it's more about our capacity for widespread, adaptable, community-level cooperation and innovation during a really protracted crisis? So the question for you is, how might you contribute to that collective resilience beyond just your own four walls? What role could communities play in supporting each other through something like that?